So here is our starting slide, natural selection and microevolution, which are honestly two very combined topics, talking through small scale evolution, right? Micro meaning small scale evolution. So when we're talking about microevolution and natural selection, we are really talking about the movement of alleles, genes, and variation amongst one population. Okay, so I'm going to be mentioning population a lot during this live cast. A population, just for your reference, is a group of the same species living in the same area. So for instance, if I was going to talk about the population of humans in Chicago, that would be accurate because we're talking about all the same species, humans, Homo sapiens, living in the same area or environment. Okay, so as we're moving through and talking about natural selection and microevolution, just remember that we're talking about one species in one environment. All right, hopefully you're following along. Okay, so we're going to start by talking about natural selection. So of course I have a picture of my very favorite person alive, not alive, but who has lived, Charles Darwin, and his amazing theory of evolution started with his trip to the Galapagos Islands, in which he noticed, which is what you're seeing in this picture right here, that the finches on each of the different islands had different beaks. So as you can see on the end of these projections here, all of these different finches have a different style of beak. And he noticed this and realized that something had happened here, right, where these finches are able to adapt, and we'll talk about adaptations in just a second, but they're able to adapt to different environments depending on the island that they live on and the food source that they are ingesting. So that was a big part of his initial discovery, is that he was noticing that the environment or environmental pressures are actually able to lead to adaptations or changes amongst a population so far enough into making these different species. So there are 8 things that need to be true for natural selection to occur. So I'm going to run through them because it's really important that you're familiar with these in order to understand how natural selection is actually occurring. Okay, so first and foremost, populations have to have an enormous potential to reproduce. If populations are not reproducing, then they're not going to be evolving and natural selection will not be occurring. Okay, because natural selection, this change over time that we're going to be looking at based on the environment, needs to have that time and those generations to come in order to actually see this change occurring. Secondly, population sizes remain stable. This is just a fact based on Darwin's studies, but also what we see all across the world. For the most part, a population size will remain stable, mainly because of numbers 3 and 4. Resources in different areas are limited, right? Regardless, we are out using our resources on Earth. I'm sure we can all agree. So resources are going to be limited, and therefore individuals will need to compete for survival. So because we have limited resources, we don't have enough for everyone, and individuals must compete for survival, our population sizes are going to remain relatively stable. Okay, along with that, you need to know that there is variation within a population. So this is going to be a big topic for tonight, that there is variation. So what that means is there's change within population. There are different alleles, there are different adaptations. When we're looking at a population, everyone doesn't look like an identical clone. Okay, we're going to find out that variation is essentially the most important part of natural selection. We would have no different things that we could act upon to select for or against. Okay. Last 3, most variation is inheritable. So it's important to know that the variation that we're seeing can be passed down to offspring. If it's not able to be passed down, then it can't contribute to natural selection because it will die within that generation, as opposed to being passed on from generation to generation. Okay, only the most fit individuals survive. So Darwin's theory, survival of the fittest. On the AP exam, they're not a big fan of you writing survival of the fittest. So that's something to keep in mind, especially if that's a phrase that you're used to hearing or hear from a teacher. It's not necessarily as accurate as just saying that organisms who are more capable of survival and reproduction are going to survive and reproduce, and therefore their offspring will inherit those traits. Okay, so that's just a more scientifically sound way of saying survival of the fittest. And it shows that you have a greater understanding of natural selection. Okay. Lastly, evolution occurs as favorable traits accumulate in a population. Okay. So some favorable traits may come and go, and we won't really see evolution occurring. It's when we see favorable traits, things that are allowing an organism to survive and to reproduce, that we really see that transformable change that we would consider evolution or natural selection. Okay, so to go back just a slide and take a look back at our original picture of Charles and his finches. Okay, these beaks are all allowing his finches to do those two things that are the most important things in life: survive, right, and reproduce. They're able to survive because they're better fit to a food source on their island. And because they're able to survive, they're therefore also more fit to reproduce. And we see those traits appear in the next generation. Okay, so there are a number of examples that we'll talk about with natural selection. It's definitely very important to know about the finches on the Galapagos. They're also a really good example of something that we call biogeography. Okay, and biogeography is the study of how various environments can affect the species that live in those environments. And because these islands are all close together yet have their own environment, it's one of our primary examples of biogeography, and therefore it shows up a lot on tests and quizzes. All right, so let me skip ahead. I'm going to show you a couple different types of selection that can occur. These are really important. I'm sure you have maybe seen a graph like this before, especially if you've talked about natural selection. This is going to show you the different ways that we can select for or against traits depending on different environmental conditions. Okay, so that top graph is just your normal Gaussian bell-shaped curve, okay, of a starting population of this case in mice, in which we see a strong increase in the middle phenotype. Okay, so the middle phenotype, we have kind of a gradient of like this lighter tan color and this darker brown color. Okay, it's like a medium brown. Uh-oh, we have audio problems. Can everyone hear me now? Wonder what happened there. Okay, good. Awesome, thanks guys. Okay, so you can see that middle gradient color, and that is representing, again, a normal bell curve, which is usually what we use to describe a starting population, a normal distribution, okay? And then you'll notice that there's 3 different possible outcomes for this population based off of 3 different drastic environmental changes, okay? So all the way on the left is something that we call stabilizing connection. Think about it. If you are a stable person, you are taking the middle ground, you are kind of middle of the road, doing exactly what you're supposed to be. So for stabilizing selection, we'll actually see a push towards that middle kind of medium blend of colors there as the favored trait for, in this case, these mice, okay? So this may happen due to some sort of environmental change that, let's say these mice have a couple different environments that they can live on, and all of a sudden it just becomes sort of a lighter brown dirt or wood chip that they're living on. That's going to allow those middle brown mice to have a better chance of surviving against predators, and therefore those are the ones that are producing offspring. So we see the increase in the spike in the middle there. Next to directional and disruptive, my students seem to always get these 2 mixed up just because they both begin with the same letter. But if you just listen to what the word is saying, directional moves in one direction, okay? So you're moving towards one extreme phenotype. We're gonna talk about peppered moths in just a second, which is a classic example of this directional selection. Okay, but what you need to be familiar with is just that one extreme phenotype is favored here. And it can't be the middle phenotype because that's what we just talked about with stabilizing selection. That's something that sometimes my students get mixed up on as well. So in this example of directional selection, we're pushing towards the extreme phenotype being the darker mice. And again, since we're talking about natural selection, we're talking about some sort of environmental change that's leading to these darker mice having a better chance of survival and reproduction. Okay, usually if we're thinking about the environment, maybe there are heavy rains, the ground is very muddy, and dark mice can blend in better. Okay, Lastly, disruptive selection. I always think of like, if you're disrupting class, you're just like slamming into the middle of my class and ruining everything. So if you have that top graph there and you just slammed the middle of the hill right there, it would create these waves up on the side, which would create quite the disruption. So if you look at disruptive selection, you'll see you're actually favoring both extreme phenotypes. Okay, so you're seeing the very, very light colored mice and the very, very dark colored mice, but not very many of those medium browns. Okay, so those three types of selection are really, really important. One that sometimes comes up as well is sexual selection, which happens, a really easy example of that is with lions or peacocks, because the males of those two species have very distinguishing features. So like the big mane of the lion or the beautiful tail of the peacock is something that the females in that breed or in that species actually select for. And that can actually lead to changes as well. All right. I believe I have that one more example as promised. So if we took a little history trip, which is not my strong suit, but it's always good to go back and reflect on history for a little. You'll notice that picture on the left is just an artist's representation of something called the Industrial Revolution, which took place in Britain. And it was basically the rise of factories and mass production and basically the start of everything that we have today. So all of the technology that you have at your fingertips, all of the things that just get mass produced and sent to you, all of those are going to be created during this Industrial Revolution. But the crazy thing, and the thing that we're going to talk about today, is how this affected the peppered moths. And the reason I want to spend time talking about this is because this is one of those examples that AP loves to cover, just because they use it all the time on the AP exam. I've seen it in free responses, I've seen it in multiple choice questions, and so it's a really important one to make sure you're familiar with. So as you'll notice in that picture, there's a darker moth on the top and a lighter one that looks peppered, like you sprinkled some pepper on it, on the bottom. And this all has to do with going into the environment in which these moths live. So they live on birch trees, which are like a nice, white, beautiful tree. We don't have any in Chicago, but they're very common in the Northeast. And because of that, for the most part, these moths were of lighter colors. Fast forward, Industrial Revolution, we're burning coal, which is filthy and terrible for the environment. And so it's just spewing toxic gas and dust and debris and pollution into the air. And it actually ends up creating something called tree smog, which is just coating these trees with like soot and dirt and debris. Because of that, those white moths no longer have the advantage to survive and reproduce. Okay, so they are actually sticking out to all the predators and are therefore getting eaten, whereas our darker moths are surviving because they're capable of blending in. They're not getting eaten by predators, and therefore they are making babies, and we're seeing more of that. Okay, so this is an example of directional selection, because we're pushing towards one extreme phenotype. We're pushing towards the darker phenotype and away from the lighter phenotype just due to the environmental change. Something really, 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 really important to understand is that no light peppered moths adapted to become darker peppered moths. Don't say that. Even if you know that that's not true, don't use that verbiage because it's completely inaccurate, right? The adaptation is the darker coloring. The adaptation is the darker coloring. So what happens to the white moths? They're not adapting at all. They're dying. They're just being eaten. They're dead. Okay, it's the darker ones that are reproducing and therefore have the adaptation and can pass their genes on, and that's why we see more of them. Okay, something that I always tell my students is that natural selection can only act upon genotypes and phenotypes that already exist among the population. Okay, so natural selection and evolution, they don't make any new crazy things just because it seems necessary. Right? You don't get to all of a sudden become spotted if that's something that's beneficial in your environment. So if you can't do it, a single-celled organism or a simple insect can't do that either. So just make sure you're being really careful. Nothing is actually adapting. It's just the things with the more beneficial traits are the ones that are surviving and therefore reproducing. Okay, cool. I think that wraps it up for natural selection. And now we can jump into variation, more microevolution stuff. And I promise, I know there's been a few questions. Hardy-Weinberg, I will try to touch on at the very end. And functional and chemical groups, I actually won't get to until like very, very briefly when we talk about origins of Earth. Okay, all right. So sources of variation. So the different things, we already talked about variation as far as being something that's essential for natural selection and evolution to occur. Different sources of variation in a population, if you think about it, are going to be mutation. Okay, so changes in the DNA can certainly lead to variation. That's how we get a lot of really great adaptations, because for sure, not all mutations are bad. Sexual reproduction. Thank goodness for sexual reproduction, because it creates a ton of variation. If you think about it, you are not a carbon copy of either of your parents, right? Because we have, during the process of meiosis, which you may have covered in an intro bio class, we have independent assortments of our chromosomes during the production of egg and sperm. So you have this blend in an egg and this blend in a sperm that are coming together and creating something that's completely and entirely unique. So there's a 1 in 8 million chance that the same two people can produce the same child, okay? 1 in 8 million. So it's not gonna happen. There's that much variation just amongst two individuals, okay? So it is a crazy and wonderful thing that contributes variation to this world. Another thing that's really awesome is this idea of diploidy, meaning that we are diploids. We have two versions of every single chromosome. We have two versions of every single gene that we have, which is super important because it allows us to have this thing called heterozygote advantage. So if you've taken any sort of genetics prereq or anything like that in a freshman bio class, then you know that you can be homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive, or heterozygous. And if you're heterozygous, you have two versions of that trait. And you are actually amazing and so necessary in our environment. And I'm going to talk about that in a second when we talk about sickle cell anemia and malaria, which is one of the most common examples of how heterozygotes can actually benefit from being heterozygotes. And you're contributing to the variation of populations. So super important to have them. Last one is outbreeding. We breed with people that are different than us. You can't breed with someone too closely related to you. It's not good for variation, and so you breed with people that aren't identical to you, and that creates even more variation. So all of these things, that some of them seem like really simple, you might not think about them, they're really, really important, and it's something good to have written down, just because you might be asked about sources of variation within a population, just because it is fundamental to allowing evolution to occur. Okay, I'm going to show you my example of heterozygote advantage, because this is one of those other ones like I was just talking about with the peppered moths. Heterozygote advantage and sickle cell anemia and malaria are one of those common examples that show this, and they show up on the AP exam quite frequently. So I will always try to cover things that we call illustrative examples in these, yes, Charlie, I'll re-explain that for you. In these talks, just because it's really, really important that you are familiar with them because they might show up again. Okay, so heterozygote advantage means that being heterozygous, so first and foremost, if you haven't taken any sort of intro bio and you're not super familiar with what it means to be homozygous dominant, heterozygous, and homozygous recessive, you have two versions of a gene called alleles that make you what you are, one from mom and one from dad. And because of that, in a very simple sense, you can have two dominant alleles, and we call them dominant just because they usually produce a protein that overpowers whatever protein the recessive allele is making. So you can have two dominant alleles, and then we call you homozygous dominant, homo meaning same, and then dominant meaning that you have those two alleles. You could have a dominant and a recessive allele like we see in that middle picture there, which means that you have one of those dominant protein producing genes and one that is not producing as much protein or any at all. And then we call you a heterozygote, hetero meaning different. And then lastly, all the way on the right, you can be homozygous recessive, homo again meaning same, recessive meaning that you have two versions of that gene that we would consider recessive, either because they're producing less or no protein is usually how that works, okay? So whenever we're talking about genes or alleles, just remember that it's DNA that's going to turn into some sort of usable protein, okay? All right. So that was your really short crash course review of genetics. We'll have a whole probably month on genetics coming up in a couple of months. But we can still get a lot out of talking about heterozygote advantage, even with limited knowledge. So what you'll see here, well, you need to know a little background on what sickle cell anemia is and what malaria is. So sickle cell anemia is a disorder that's inherited, so you can pass it down to your offspring. And if you are homozygous recessive, so if you get two recessive versions of a gene, okay, that would be you all the way on the right. We have that as two lowercase a's because we use lowercase letters to represent recessive. Then you have your blood cells actually look like these curved sickles. Like if you think about what the Grim Reaper holds, meant for farmers, but that's a sickle, okay? So it's like a hook or a moon shape, which is not the normal shape of your blood cells. So if you know anything about your red blood cells, you'll know that they carry oxygen for you. And so having red blood cells that look like a hook instead of like a nice big circle is going to be a problem for you. And so actually most of the people who do have sickle cell anemia, especially in countries where it's more common, will pass away from that. It can be fatal at kind of a young age, okay? On the left-hand side of the spectrum, if you are a fully healthy homozygous dominant, meaning that you got two strong copies of that gene for blood cell production, then you have nice, round, happy blood cells, and you can carry lots of oxygen just fine. And then in the middle, if you're heterozygous, you have some genes that are making those nice, round, plump blood cells for you. And then you have that one gene, that lowercase a, that's actually providing some of those sickle-shaped blood cells, okay? So you have a mix, and that's a good way to think about what homozygous dominant versus heterozygous versus homozygous recessive is, just by looking at this graphic and noticing that the middle is a mix of the two. So where this comes into play is in areas such as Africa, where both sickle cell anemia and the disorder malaria are very common. So malaria is a disorder that's carried by mosquitoes that when you're bitten with it, the parasite actually infects your red blood cells. And then it travels and it stays throughout your body and it can make you really, really sick. Well, the thing is, if your blood cells aren't round, right? So remember, if you're healthy, your blood cells are round and plump. If your blood cells are sickled, the parasite actually can't enter that cell. It can't attach and it can't get inside of that cell. So if you have those sickled cells, you're actually protected from getting malaria, or you're just getting a very mild version of it. So on the right-hand side of the spectrum, if you're homozygous recessive for sickle cell disease, you're probably going to pass away at a young age from this disease. If you're on the left-hand side and you have these nice plump blood cells, but you live in an area such as Africa where malaria is very common, you can get infected with malaria and potentially pass away from that as well. But then in the middle, we hit kind of this advantageous spot, being a heterozygote, where not only are you not really showing your sickle cell disease, but you're also incapable of being infected with malaria because the parasite can't get inside of your blood cells. So this is what we call a heterozygote advantage, because if you are heterozygous, then not only are you not really infected with sickle cell anemia, but you're also not really infected with malaria either. So again, in America, there is no heterozygote advantage here because malaria is not a problem that we have. So there's really no advantage because you're not being faced with these parasitic mosquitoes and we're not at risk of dying from malaria. But in areas like Africa, where people do die from malaria every day, there's actually a benefit to carrying this sickle cell disease. And that's why it's still a problem today, because those carriers then can pass it on to their offspring. Thank you, Maram, for answering that question. So with all of these things that I've been talking about, and I should have prefaced this earlier, you'll notice that you have two versions of a gene. You can have two dominant versions of that gene, a dominant and a recessive, or two recessive. Anytime you see the prefix di or di, it just means two. Okay, so in this case, dihybrid, you have two different alleles, or diploid, diploid, you can have two different alleles, which means you have two different versions of a gene. Hopefully that answers that question, Carly. Okay. Any questions about heterozygote advantage? So the reason that the population benefits from heterozygote advantage, besides just these people being able to live longer, is that we have this variation now within our population. So remember, we just talked about how variation is key to natural selection and evolution occurring. We need different genes, we need different versions of traits in order to have a population actually be able to have evolution occurring or natural selection. And so if you have heterozygotes, then they have these two different versions of the trait that they can pass on to their offspring, which leads to a more diverse gene pool. Okay, move on then to my next slide. All right. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about variation and the different ways that we can change allele frequencies. So remember, an allele is just a version of a gene. I always use, I don't know why, I'm going to grab them. I'm just sitting in my classroom looking at them. I always use poker chips to explain alleles, okay? And again, like we just talked about, we're diploid for all of these different things, okay? We have a version of each gene from mom and a version of each gene from dad, okay? So you can have two of the same alleles, or you can have two different alleles, okay? But in our population, right, we're going to look at all of the different alleles that our organisms possess, okay? So if we have lots of homozygous dominant individuals, then we're going to have lots of that version of the trait, that dominant version of the trait in our gene pool. Whereas if we have a lot of heterozygotes, like we just talked about in our population, then we might have a more even split between dominant and recessive alleles, okay, or dominant and recessive traits that can then be passed on to offspring, okay? This is also going to be essential. I know someone said that they were learning about, or they had a Hardy-Weinberg test tomorrow. When you're talking about Hardy-Weinberg, which we might get to in the end here, you're going to be talking about the dominant and the recessive alleles within a population and how they change or don't change. Okay, so here are the reasons why an allele frequency might change, and there's a lot of vocab here, so this is definitely some important stuff to write down, and then I have some graphics to depict what all of these mean. Okay, so number one, natural selection, we've already talked about. If the environment changes, the amount of alleles in that population are going to change. Okay, so if we go back to a simple example like the mice with their different coloring, and we have lots of homozygous dominant mice that are a darker color, and all of a sudden the environment starts to get lighter, then we're going to see less of the dominant alleles in the population because these guys are going to be dying, they're going to be eaten, or they're going to no longer be able to reproduce. And then we might see some more recessive alleles sneaking into the population because that's what's beneficial with the environment at that time. Okay, so we'll definitely be able to see shifts in whether or not we have dominant or recessive alleles in a population because of the environment and natural selection. Second, and we already talked about this, but mutations are definitely a contributor to having changes in allele frequencies, just because you're mutating or you're changing the DNA of that individual, and so that could provide an entirely different version of that gene, like something that we have never seen before. So that's definitely going to lead to a change. The next two, gene flow and genetic drift, are really, really important contributors to allele frequencies. And they're also something that my students get mixed up because, again, they both start with G, but they're very different. So make sure you're paying attention to what the words are saying and spend some time learning the difference because they're actually going to have very different effects on the population. So number 3, gene flow. It sounds like what it is. So genes are flowing into and out of the population. If you think about like immigration or emigration, that's a perfect example of gene flow. For humans, our gene flow is off the charts because we can hop on a plane and go to a whole different country and start a family there. And now our genes and whatever traits that we have by being Americans, right, have, and from our great ancestors, are now mixing with another gene pool from a different area. Okay, so gene flow, I'm going to grab some pictures here. That looks like a mirror image, unfortunately. I have some pictures on the next page. But gene flow is just going to be when one organism from one population joins another population, and it's going to make that population usually more diverse or have more variation. Okay. And again, it's because wherever they're coming from, they may have had a different environment or different selective pressures or just a different mating pool. There were different options for them to mate with. And so when they're joining a new population, they're going to be contributing that into that group's gene pool. So gene flow is awesome, and it's going to increase genetic variation for the most part, okay, which is definitely an important distinction. Genetic drift, on the other hand, is going to be a chance event. This is another important thing to write down, is going to be a chance event that greatly decreases the size of a population, okay? When you decrease the size of a population, you are innately going to decrease the amount of genetic variation in that population, okay? The way that I explain it sometimes is, think about if all of a sudden something crazy happens to our Earth and there were 10 people left that had to populate the entire Earth again, right? There is a lot less variation in those 10 people than in the 7+ billion people that we have on Earth, right? So the variation in the new population of humans on Earth is going to be much, much smaller than what we had prior to said catastrophe. Okay, so there are 2 different ways that can manifest. So these next 2 are both examples of genetic drift. One is called the bottleneck effect, and one is called the founder effect. So bottleneck effect is an example like what I just talked about. If the Earth, something meteor hit the Earth and only 10 people were left, that would be an example of the bottleneck effect. So here's a graphic, and I think I have it on the next slide. But you can see a lot of variation in our starting population, and then only a few people. They always show it through the neck of a bottle because it illustrates that only a few are going to survive whatever catastrophic event it is, are going to remain. And then that is the only variation that we will see in the offspring. Okay, so we started with a relatively diverse population, and we're ending up with a relatively same unanimous population of just blues and yellows in this case, because only a few survived, and that is the only genes and the only traits that we have that can be passed on. Okay. The second example of genetic drift, and remember that both of these are due to usually chance, some sort of chance event that's greatly decreasing the population. The founder effect is exactly what it sounds like. So you have a group from a starting population, they're circled over here, that moves, goes somewhere else. Maybe they're island hopping, they go find a new island to live on. This is like what happened with Darwin's finches. They just decided that the grass was greener somewhere else. And those small group of individuals are the only genes, whatever genes they have, are the only genes that are going to be seen in the new population that they form on their new island or their new wherever they decide to go. Okay, so in both of those, you have a very small subset of a larger population that are then responsible for reproducing, and they are innately going to have less variation than the starting population. So as a rule, genetic drift will greatly decrease variation in a population, whereas gene flow, again, that movement of alleles into a population will actually increase your variation. Okay. Last one for changes in allele frequencies is non-random mating. And that goes back to what we were talking about a little bit earlier with like sexual selection. Non-random mating just means that you are having a choice in your mate, okay? On the flip side, which is kind of the easiest way to describe non-random mating, completely random mating means that whoever you bump into is your mate, right? That doesn't happen. It's a good thing, right? So we have choice, and so do almost every species on Earth. They will choose who their mate is, okay? And because of that, there are certain traits that are going to just be more favorable and be propagated more frequently. All right, just really quick. Between two populations, though, gene flow, let me just answer this real quick question about gene flow. So between two populations, gene flow decreases variation, right? So as a whole, gene flow usually is going to increase variation between populations. I guess I don't fully understand your question, because so if you take one individual from, let's say, wherever you live, so Chicago would be my example, and then you move them to somewhere in Africa, right? The genes that you're bringing are going to be very different than the genes that already exist in that population in Africa. And therefore, when you reproduce, if you reproduce with people in that area, you are increasing the variation because you are adding your genes into that mix. Does that make sense, Tommaso? Hopefully it does. Okay. Cool. I'm going to move on then to our next slide. But again, just remember, anytime that you're throwing in genes from a different population into another population, you're going to be increasing the variation there just because you're adding new things that they might not have already had. Okay, there are my lovely pictures. Look, I could have been doing this the whole time and not showing you my little word wall. But just a reminder, and now you should have access to this with the bottleneck and with your ancestral population. I like that example of founder effect because you see that only 2 of the original 3 starting colors of butterflies make it onto the new island, which means they've completely lost that white butterfly trait, and therefore will not have that in their new founding population. Okay. All right. We're going to segue back because this is a really, really great example of a lot of the different things that we've talked about. Then I actually have some practice questions for you guys, multiple choice questions, just to take a look and make sure that you have a good understanding of natural selection and microevolution. So antibiotic resistance. Oh, this is something that I have nightmares about, and you should too, because bacteria are trying to take over the world, and we got to be prepared for them. But we're not spending money on antibiotics. So this is my lesson to you, to always finish your antibiotics when you get them. Never, ever, 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 ever just stop taking them because you feel better, because you are contributing to the end of the world. It's a little dramatic, but you'll see what I mean in a second. So here's my graphic for antibiotic resistance, and you'll notice that our starting population up at the top there, where you see various shades of yellow, pink, and red, those are bacteria that have all sorts of resistance levels, from really low to really high resistance levels to some sort of antibiotic, whatever antibiotic that we're using to try to kill them. Penicillin, ampicillin, who knows? So after selection, you'll notice that only the bacteria, so what that means is something happened, the environment changed. Mainly, we put very toxic chemicals into our bodies that are trying to kill or decimate this entire population. Okay, so the only ones that remain are the ones that have a really high resistance to this bacteria. Okay, the problem is now those are the ones that are surviving and reproducing, right? Classic natural selection example, except we are forcing them to do this because we're allowing them by killing off all of their weak brethren, and the only ones left are the ones that can already fend off from that antibiotic. Okay, so our final population is a really, really strong population of bacteria that already have some sort of antibiotic resistance. So this comes up on every single AP examination that I have seen, because it's evolution happening at rapid speed. Okay? The reason that antibiotic resistance happens so fast is because bacteria replicate. The fastest bacteria replicate once every 20 minutes. Okay, so if you have a starting population of 1, then you have 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64. Whew, it goes up really, really fast, really, really quickly, exponentially, you could say. And so they're able to pass on new traits much more quickly than we do, which is like 2 kids per the average 1 person. So yes, Rosemary, take your antibiotics, take all of them, because if you only take like 8 of your 10-day antibiotics, the bacteria that are remaining that could survive are going to be the ones that are the strongest, like these pink and red ones that you see. And therefore you could pass those on to someone else and then they try to take an antibiotic and it doesn't work. It's a huge problem right now, which is another reason why AP focuses on it a lot, because they really, really like to focus 1 free response question a year on a current event. So that's something to inspire you to read, like New York Times Science or a different science publication that you like. I'm a big New York Times Science fan, but the AP exam will always have 1, usually a long free response question, which is like 30% of your free response grade on something that is currently happening in the science community. So get out there and read the news. Do I think that phage therapy could prevent? Interesting. Carson, that's a question that if we have time at the end, I would love to answer because I have a lot of theories on it. I should have mentioned this in the beginning. I was a microbiology major, so I will always geek out on small cell organisms whenever I possibly can. All right. I want you guys to, let me see, I think I can poll you guys. Ooh, okay, let me see if I can create a poll here. I'm working on it. I'm just gonna call it question 1, and there are 4 answer choices. So I want you guys to read through this multiple choice question. Oops, give me a second. You can be reading through it while I'm figuring out how to work this technology. Do you guys see it? Do you see the poll? Maybe at the bottom of your screen where it says polls. Awesome. Okay, perfect. This is going to be great then. So read through this question. I have a little hint for you. It's what I was mentioning earlier. Okay, and I want you to take your best guess at the answers, A through D. And I'll take a look at your poll. Yes, I do want you to answer. Answer on my poll. I'll give you guys like 30 more seconds to read through and answer. This is great. This is going to make question asking so easy. Looks like I have about half of you in here. Maybe half of you fell asleep on me already. Tragic. All right, it looks like, I'll wrap it up there. It looks like we're all on the same trend, which is awesome. So C is gonna be the right answer here. And it's something that students mess up all the time, so you can go back into your classroom and be a champion at talking about natural selection in knowing that, read the hint again, environmental factors are never going to create traits, okay? So this is for some reason another thing that students think all the time. They're like, oh, the bacteria are adapting to the antibiotic, right? They're just like getting stronger. And that's just not true, right? If we got doused with toxic chemicals, we wouldn't all of a sudden just adapt and not be hurt by those toxic chemicals, unless we, real quick put our heads together and went into a lab somewhere, right? But if we can't do it, if we can't all of a sudden change our body structure and what proteins we're making in order to fend off something, then bacteria, a single-celled organism with just a little strip of DNA, certainly cannot do that, okay? So the only way that drug resistance spreads is by knowing the answer is C, that some drug-resistant bacteria were present at the start of treatment, okay? So anytime you see something like that, that's always gonna be the answer. And now you're a pro, and we'll get all those questions right. All right, let's see, where are we at on time? Okay, I'm gonna ask maybe like 2 more questions here just to practice with some of the other concepts that we've talked about to show that you guys have understood some of the things that we talked about, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about 5 Google and let you go on with your evening. So, next question. I'm gonna pull this as question 2. It should be up in a second for you to answer. All right, it's up there for you. You guys about 30 more seconds to cast your votes. Oh, we got some vote switchers out there, cheaters. All right, it looks like we've all honed in on the answer being C. Yeah, so with genetic drift, so remember A and B would be a really great example of gene flow, immigration and emigration, okay? But genetic drift is when we have that chance event that is going to cause those significant changes due to the fact that the population is just a lot smaller. You can always think back to my end of the world example for that one, okay? Looks like we'll do maybe 1 or 2 more questions. These are all AP level questions too, so if you feel like they're easy, that just means you're gonna kill it on the AP exam. Oh, I gotta start a poll. You guys read through that. Let's be question 3. Poll is up there whenever you're ready. Take about 20 more seconds. All right, you guys are too good. Looks like most of you found your answer or your way to the answer choice B. So remember, genetic drift is going to be some sort of event in which we have a much smaller population with different traits in it. And then the big giveaway here was the second part of that answer, which was founder's effect, because we have this group. Oh, what is founder effect? So founder effect is when you have a small group of people that are literally going and founding a new area. Okay, so in my example here, oh, that's bottleneck effect. Here we have a small group of the starting population going off somewhere else, and so like when I talked about them island hopping or something like that, in which they're going to start a new population. If you think about Darwin's finches and those birds going off onto a new island, that would be another good example of founder effect. So it's just a small group from a starting population, there's less variation in that population, and they're going off to find a new home, and then they're reproducing there. So I saw, I think someone had picked, we had a couple other answer choices. So I can tell you why the others are not going to be correct. So when you're talking about natural selection, so answer choice C, whatever trait that you're seeing, it has to give that individual an advantage in their environment. And as far as we know, there's no advantage to having this blue skin. It's also not going to be a bottleneck because the original population wasn't decimated. It wasn't killed off. They just left from a starting group. Sexual selection and mutations, for as far as we know, there's no one that's selecting to just mate with blue-skinned people. That's not explicitly clear. And there's no necessarily example of a mutation occurring within this smaller population. So that's not necessarily a completely wrong answer. So this is something that you kind of have to get used to with AP Bio or any AP class. They do this fun thing where it's like there's an answer that's right-ish, and then there's an answer that's definitely right or most correct. It's the same thing on the SAT. If you guys are familiar with taking the SAT, there is just a better or more correct answer, and it usually goes back to the one that's more simple, the one that you have to make less like extraneous connections to. Genetic equilibrium is meaning that everything would be even. So equilibrium is always going to be some sort of even baseline. And I don't see this happening here because blue skin is definitely not our equilibrium for humans. So hopefully that helps clear up what other people were asking about. All right. I know a lot of you wanted me to talk about Hardy-Weinberg. I think that might have to be our entire session next week. So tune in. I know that doesn't help whoever has a test tomorrow, but I would be more than happy. It's a very, very lengthy topic, and it involves a lot of need for practice questions. And so I don't want to rush through it and not do it justice, because it's definitely important. It definitely will show up on your AP exam. I can guarantee that. So we can spend all of next week talking about it to make sure that you guys feel really, really comfortable with Hardy-Weinberg, because that will set you apart from some of your peers. But I know Amanda is here and wants to talk a little bit about Fiveable and promote how you guys can see me every week and what that costs and what that looks like. So I'm going to put up Amanda's last slide. And I think she's going to jump in and talk. Amanda, are you jumping in? Or do you want me to talk? I'm not sure if she's jumping in. Oh, I have to bring her on. Ah, look at that. Oh, sorry, guys. Give me 1 second. There we go. Here she comes. Drum roll, please.
Hello.
Hopefully. Oh, there we go.
What up, y'all? We have a lot of students in here that were a big part of Fiveable last year. Yeah, look at, it's Amanda, woohoo! So you guys, listen, if you are not already a member of Fiveable, you definitely are going to want to join, because Caroline just killed it. I don't even know science, and I feel like I could do biology now. No, but for real. So we're doing a back to school special. So it's usually $5 per month per subject. But you can get your first month's free with the code back to school. So jump in now, then you can get that Hardy-Weinberg, which I don't even know what it is. I'm excited to learn about that next week. And so you can get all the different things that are coming up this month. What are some of the other topics that you're going to be covering?
Yeah, so we'll do macroevolution. We're going to talk about the origins of life, which will cover kind of some of that biochemistry stuff that students get a little bit confused about. We'll talk about the different scientists that help contribute to the theory of the origin of life and the start of Earth. And then I think that rounds it out for September. And then we're going to jump into some stuff with cells.
Awesome. So I just put the link in the chat. Notice that the link on the slide is the stats one. We're going to be live with stats in 3 minutes with Shane. So if you guys are not yet a member of Fiveable, definitely join, and you can get, like I said, this whole month for free. So I don't know where else on the internet you can get live support like this, but we're building an empire, something like that. All right, y'all. So the link's in the chat. I'm going to head over to AP Stats and, learn some statistics, because there's another subject that I don't know. But next week, we'll be live again with all these subjects, and you can get access to any of them that you need. So, Caroline, thank you so much. Killed it.
Awesome. Guys, it was great to interact with you all. And please come back next week. We'd love to be able to work with you guys some more. Yeah, next week, just really quickly check. I believe next week is actually going to be Tuesday. I'm a cross-country coach, and we have a meet next Wednesday. So it'll be next Tuesday, but then we'll be back on schedule.
Awesome. Sweet. Awesome. Cool. All right. Well, I'll see you guys later. And if you are taking AP Stats, hop on over to the stats sessions.
Cool. Thanks, guys. I'll tune in with you next Tuesday.
Bye.